Imagine being locked in a room with two other people, and all three of you believe you're the Son of God. You don't just think it, you know it. You've lived it. It's your truth. And now someone's telling you they believe it too. Who's lying? Who's delusional? Or are you all insane? This isn't a psychological thriller. This isn't fiction. It happened in 1959 in Ypsilanti, Michigan. At the state psychiatric hospital, 3 men diagnosed with schizophrenia were brought together by a psychologist named Milton Rokeach. Each man believed he was Jesus Christ. Rokeach had a bold idea. If they were confronted with others who shared their exact delusion, would they be forced to confront the truth? Would they wake up from their psychosis? Or would their beliefs dig even deeper into the mind? The result wasn't what anyone expected. What started as a clinical experiment slowly unraveled into something far stranger: ethical gray zones, manipulation, identity crises, and a glimpse into the human mind when belief is the only thing holding it together. Over the course of 2 years, these men fought, argued, cried, and even physically attacked each other. They tried to convince one another they were the only real Christ. They each believed the others were fakes, robots, or mentally disturbed patients planted to confuse them. What happens when your delusion is no longer just yours, but shared? Can logic override belief, or is belief the strongest force of all? This is the story of the 3 Christs of Ypsilanti, an experiment that still echoes in psychology textbooks, mental health debates, and ethical discussions decades later. In the late 1950s, America's mental institutions were a world unto themselves, isolated, misunderstood, and often overcrowded. One such place was Ypsilanti State Hospital in Michigan. Tucked away from the public eye, it housed more than 3,000 patients, most of them forgotten by society. Diagnoses ranged from depression to extreme schizophrenia, and treatments varied from counseling to shock therapy. In this environment, psychologist Milton Rokeach stepped in with an experiment few dared to imagine. He was a professor and researcher who believed that identity was not fixed. Rokeach believed that delusional identity could be reshaped, even rewritten, if confronted correctly. That belief led him to 3 particular patients, all diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, all claiming they were Jesus Christ. Clyde Benson was a soft-spoken man in his 60s. He had once lived a normal life, but after the death of his wife, his mental health deteriorated. When he arrived at Ypsilanti, he told staff he had died and come back, proving he was the Messiah. Joseph Cassell was the intellectual. Well-read, verbose, and articulate, Joseph corresponded with imaginary figures like Queen Elizabeth and believed he was on a divine mission. He often wrote long philosophical treatises defending his godhood. Leon Gabor, in contrast, was aggressive and reactive. A former U.S. Army veteran, Leon believed that his identity as Christ had been stolen by the hospital. He claimed his family had been replaced by imposters, and he spoke of conspiracies and secret missions from God. They had never met before, but now Rokeach was going to introduce them, not as fellow patients, but as direct contradictions to one another. Could the collision of their delusions spark self-awareness? Would they realize they weren't who they thought they were? Rokeach was determined to find out. He had no script, no guarantees, and no ethical review board to stop him. What he created was a living experiment, raw, unpredictable, and controversial from the very beginning. The first meeting was awkward and tense. 3 men seated in a room, each convinced he was the one and only Christ. Rokeach sat quietly, taking notes, letting the conversation unfold naturally. Clyde Benson sat with his hands folded, rarely speaking unless prompted. His belief in his identity was rooted in emotion, not logic. He wasn't a philosopher or a preacher. He just knew. He had died. He had risen. And that was that. Joseph Cassell was different. He was a talker, intellectual, confident, and argumentative. He spoke in circles, quoting scripture and philosophy. To him, this wasn't just faith, it was a divine responsibility. Leon Gabor, perhaps the most volatile, was combative from the start. He immediately rejected the others, claiming they were liars, phonies, or government-controlled robots. His delusion was wrapped in paranoia. The room was a powder keg. Conversations often turned to arguments. Joseph accused Leon of being delusional. Leon shouted back, calling him an imposter. Clyde mostly sat in silence, sometimes nodding, sometimes retreating inward. The clash was fascinating and heartbreaking. These weren't just symptoms on a chart. These were deeply held identities. And Rokeach, behind the glass, was watching it all unfold, hoping perhaps that one of them might crack. But something unexpected happened. Instead of letting go of their delusions, each man's belief hardened. They developed elaborate rationalizations. Clyde decided the other two were patients in need of help. Joseph believed the hospital planted the other two to test his faith. Leon theorized they were machines built to confuse him. Rather than breaking their identities, the experiment became a battleground of egos, survival, and delusion. Each man refused to let go of his reality because doing so meant confronting a terrifying truth, that their entire world might not be real. The meetings continued weekly. Rokeach observed, recorded, and sometimes intervened. But what was meant to be an experiment in compassionate confrontation quickly became something darker. In theory, being face-to-face with others who shared the same grand delusion should force the mind to reevaluate. Cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding two contradictory beliefs, should create a crack in their false reality. But that didn't happen. Instead, the three men became more creative in protecting their identities. Each developed his own narrative. Clyde believed the others were patients who needed healing. Joseph saw them as decoys sent to test him. Leon accused the hospital of creating robotic imposters. Rokeach wasn't just a silent observer. He began inserting new variables. He would leave notes for the men, typed letters from imaginary people in their lives. He posed as a fictional character named Dr. Y and sent Joseph a series of letters from a supposed divine authority. He told Leon that God had new instructions for him, which contradicted his previous beliefs. The responses were disturbing. Joseph became distressed, confused by these messages. Leon grew more paranoid and aggressive. Clyde sometimes withdrew completely. Rather than opening their minds, the conflicting information seemed to splinter them further. In one session, Joseph tried to physically attack Leon after being mocked. In another, Leon claimed he had special access to an underground army sent by God to destroy the fakes. The room wasn't a place of healing. It was a psychological battleground, three men defending their sense of self against everything that threatened it. Rokeach continued to push, fascinated by the results. But what was he really studying? Delusion, or the human need to protect identity at all costs? The line between science and manipulation blurred, and slowly the question shifted from, "What will they believe?" to, "How far will Rokeach go?" The experiment spiraled. What began as a test of delusion became a disturbing game of control. Rokeach continued manipulating their environments, sending fake letters, giving contradictory divine orders, and watching how the men responded. At one point, Joseph began to question if he was being deceived by higher powers. He became agitated, losing sleep, trying to decode messages from the heavens. Rokic had become a puppeteer, pulling strings not just to observe, but to provoke. Leon's paranoia intensified. He accused staff members of poisoning his food. He started isolating himself, writing increasingly erratic messages. Clyde, meanwhile, became more depressed and withdrawn, his gentle demeanor now a quiet resignation. Behind the mirror, Rokic kept taking notes. He justified his actions by claiming he was furthering science. But was this still research or cruelty? Decades later, Rokic would write, "I had no right to play God, and I can only ask for forgiveness." It was a rare moment of self-reflection from a man who had used three vulnerable individuals as tools in a social experiment. In many ways, the three Christs had become mirrors, not just for each other, but for Rokic himself, exposing the dangers of unchecked authority. The psychological toll was immense. After 2 years, there were no breakthroughs. None of the men gave up their identity. The experiment had failed if the goal was to cure them, but it had succeeded in showing just how far the human mind will go to protect itself, even in madness, and how easily scientific curiosity can tip into moral blindness. By 1961, the project came to an end. The three men were separated. The weekly meetings stopped. Rokic moved on to other research, later publishing a book titled The Three Christs of Ypsilanti. But what about Clyde, Joseph, and Leon? They didn't change. They didn't recant. Their delusions remained as rooted as ever. Each still believed he was the one true Jesus. The experiment hadn't cured anyone. It had only deepened their need to protect their beliefs. But perhaps the most profound effect was not on the patients, but on Rokic himself. In the years that followed, Rokic began to question his own role in the experiment. He reread his notes and journals and realized how far he had strayed from ethical research. He later admitted that he had become part of the delusion, just in a different way. He wasn't observing from the outside. He was trying to engineer belief. He wrote, "I became a fourth Christ in that room. I imposed my own belief system on theirs." In the end, the three Christs remained in institutional care until their deaths. They never met again. But their story lived on. Psychology textbooks would cite the case as both revolutionary and deeply flawed. Ethical review boards today use it as an example of what not to do in experimental psychology. The men who once thought they were divine became symbols, not of madness, but of how deeply identity can take root, even when everything around you says it's false. What can we learn from the three Christs? At first glance, it's just a bizarre case study. Three men in a hospital, each insisting they were Jesus. But dig deeper, and it's a haunting exploration of the human mind. Identity isn't just what we believe, it's who we are. And when identity is threatened, even by logic, it fights back. These men didn't just believe they were Christ. That belief was a life raft. It made sense of their world. It gave them purpose. Without it, they had nothing. The case also reveals the fragile line between research and manipulation. Rokic wasn't a monster, but he was reckless. He became obsessed with results, and in doing so, he overlooked the humanity of the very people he was studying. Today, The Three Christs of Ypsilanti is a cautionary tale, not just about schizophrenia or delusion, but about ethics, empathy, and how we treat the most vulnerable among us. Science must ask bold questions, but it must never forget that the people inside the experiment are people. Rokic would later dedicate his book to Clyde, Joseph, and Leon, perhaps as an apology, perhaps as a confession. Their minds were broken, their identities fragmented, but in the end, their story taught the world something real. Even in madness, there is meaning. This has been the story of the three Christs of Ypsilanti. If you found this as fascinating as we did, subscribe for more deep dives into real psychological history. And remember, behind every diagnosis, there's a story worth hearing.